There's a few people here now. Welcome back. So we had a bad echo on the first feed, but seems that we're back. Unfortunately, we lost a few people, but we'll see if people rejoin us. But thanks for dealing with that, and thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you, Rick, for being here to talk tonight about West and East Coast in the Great Lakes and some of the differences that Rick and I have seen between the two and how we would go about preparing to travel from one to the other. So Rick, if you don't mind, just we know that you I think most of the people on here tuning in are well familiar with your long history of steelheading the Great Lakes, but may not know as much that you've traveled quite a bit to the West Coast as well. And if you could just tell us a little bit about the fisheries you've been to, and then we can kind of get into more of the details, but some of your favorite West Coast experiences and yeah.
Yeah. Well, most of my West Coast experience has been in British Columbia, and either on the Skeena system or the Dean. I think since 1995, I went back and just did a little count. I've made 16 trips out there, so it's like 2 out of every 3 years I make it out to BC. When I started, the first year was 95. That was even before most anglers, or even any anglers, were using two-handed rods. That was kind of still before the two-handed rod revolution. So, our first few years out there, we were fishing single-handers, and it wasn't till probably the trip I made in 98 where we started dabbling with two-handers and then really kind of committed to it out there anyways. In the maybe around 2000, 1999, I think is when I went full-time with one. So kind of saw that evolution out there, but mainly the Skeena system, Bulkley, Maurice, Babine, the main Skeena, Kispiox a little bit, and then the Dean. So it's really been my experiences, and I've loved it out there. Loved every minute of it. I think when I first started going out there, it was really, in terms of Great Lakes anglers, there was almost, I think back in those, in the 90s there was a real distinction, between the fisheries, in that there really wasn't that many anglers from the Great Lakes going out west. And I think that's really changed in the last 10 years. I do think there's much more direct connection. I certainly know a lot of anglers, that I've fished with for many years in the Great Lakes that, are either have been out to the West Coast, are planning to go. So really there's been I'd say in the last 10 to 20 years, just a greater connection between the two fisheries. And, it's kind of neat to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of the reasoning for wanting to do this on my end is when I talk to people these days out here in the West, with the really unfortunate circumstances we've faced in the last few years with low returns of fish and closed rivers, there's an increased interest in traveling from the West to experience the Great Lakes. And I think one of the neat things is, for me, when I return to my home state of Michigan and stuff like that, is it's, the fishery you have in the Great Lakes in a lot of ways is a guilt-free fishery, where here in the West, I personally have felt fairly guilty the last few years about pursuing a fish that's struggling mightily at the moment. But when you look at coming to the Great Lakes, it is a non-native with sometimes pretty robust runs of fish, and it's a great new experience for a lot of people who've primarily West Coast steelheaded. It's a new thing, so it's hard too. So.
Yeah, and I certainly this past year or two, and unfortunately with what went on in BC, had some calls from clients, prospective clients that have never fished in the Great Lakes but have fished out west before, and are looking at it as an alternative, especially given the closures and everything, unfortunately. So
exactly. Yeah.
maybe you could talk, Zach, just a little bit, because this is one thing that popped in my mind when I was kind of thinking about tonight. But what drove you to leave Michigan? I mean, I have, throughout my life, I kind of looked, and I've never, I've never really left, more than about, I live about 15 miles away from where I grew up. Certainly had plenty of opportunities, throughout my life to relocate and go other places. I always kind of just found the fishery here, just not just the steelhead fishery, but just, everything that kind of the Great Lakes has to offer from a variety standpoint. I just have never driven me to leave. I'm just wondering, what was your impetus to go out west, and what drove you to, to that?
Yeah, uniqueness of experience. I mean, it was steelhead that brought me from growing up in Michigan and steelheading there. And, I think I was searching for new experiences in new places. I'd fished, pretty extensively in Michigan, where I grew up from a child, and some, as we've talked, in Western New York, where I had family as well. And then around 2009, I took my first West Coast steelhead trip in the fall to the Clearwater, and then followed it up with that same year a couple of trips to the Olympic Peninsula. And it was steelhead that made me make that change, but a lot of it was just seeing new places. The Olympic Peninsula and the Clearwater both were so captivating for me. And also just, personal life. Like I went from working an office job that didn't feel like a long-term plan for me to moving out west, living out of the back of my truck, fishing steelhead till I ran out of money, and then starting my own guide service, and from there. So, like now that I've experienced both for quite some time, there's things I love about both of them. One of the things that I returned to Michigan from my first trip on the Olympic Peninsula, and on the very last day of that trip, I'd hooked what still is the biggest fish of my life and lost it. And you return home after ending a trip on something like that, and it doesn't leave your mind. So that probably played a big role for me in moving to the West Coast, was just that fish.
That makes sense.
But now, time's passed, and man, there's so many fisheries in the Great Lakes that I also miss and don't get the opportunity as often as I'd like to return to. But I do get back to Michigan every couple years, and usually fish with some of my old buddies on the rivers I grew up fishing, which were primarily the Grand River in Grand Rapids, which is a pretty unique urban fishery, but then some of the smaller tributaries like the Pere Marquette and Rogue River, and then the big water, the Muskegon and the Manistee and stuff like that. And really, really diverse, awesome rivers. And I think about going back often, more often than I actually make it back. But so.
Yeah,
that
very
answer
cool.
your question?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I over the years had a handful of friends, and they were customers of our shop that ended up going out west in various parts of the western part of the U.S. for similar reasons. They just point a perfect time in their life to make a change, and found something they fell in love with, and it happens.
Yeah, lot to be experienced with both. So,
yep.
Let's get into the nitty gritty of it. So how would you prepare? You're going to let's start with this system specifically or something. And first, maybe talk about your typical equipment for Western New York and how that changes when you go to the Skeena.
Well, I think we have such a, as you mentioned, in Michigan and New York and in Ontario is very similar. There's such a wide range of rivers in terms of, how we rig. But I would say, in terms of, equipment, I find at least in the Great Lakes rivers, I've kind of gone shorter and shorter with rods, and using, a fair amount of Skagit heads just for the versatility of the different types of water that we fish. Also, we're mainly fishing winter run fish. So, our best fishing a lot of times is the mid to end of the fall into winter. So a lot of colder water type of fishing. So, the Skagit lines kind of, play, at least that's been my approach. I just seem to fish those more and more. So I tend to use, I guess that would be one main difference with the equipment. I tend to use shorter rods in the Great Lakes. Then my experience out west, you're fishing a little bit more of a summer, well, not a little more, but you're fishing for summer run fish. If you go out there early enough, I like to fish higher in the water column, using longer rods, longer heads. So there's less stripping involved when I'm using a floating line, either on the surface or, just below. So I think those are, two of the bigger differences, fairly bigger water, I think in general that I'm fishing out west as well. Where, there's a little more of a tendency in the Great Lakes to find a little more intimate water settings. So again, not necessarily needing the same length of cast, but, needing more control and, working specific structure and things of that nature. So those are really the, kind of the two biggest things that I see, just, fishing a little more up in the water column out west. Not that you can't do that in Great Lakes. There's no hard and fast rules to any of this. There's certainly, there's variations in both fisheries, but, in general, that's been my experience.
For sure. I think, for me, most of the time here in the West has been spent fall steelheading on the Snake River systems, the Clearwater, the Grand Ronde, the Snake itself, and winter fishing on the Olympic Peninsula, which are two very different fisheries in their own right. The Olympic Peninsula, usually Skagit lines, usually fairly decent sink tips. The Snake River system, almost entirely a dry line. And we'll get into flies as well, some contrast there as well. But yeah, for me, when I go back to the Great Lakes, I've got, as I was kind of mentioning, in Michigan for sure, we're fishing. I'm either going to be fishing some pretty small water or some really brawling big water that we're actually often fishing from a boat. And so, very contrasting stuff there. But yeah, I'm probably going to travel back to Michigan with one short rod, 11.5 foot max for small water, and a Skagit line. And those rivers, as they're deep slots, very specific holding water, and it's probably going to be a very short Skagit head and a relatively heavy sink tip, heavier than I normally fish. Even on the Olympic Peninsula, T14, T17, and maybe a shorter length. And I'm going to be tucking on the Pierre Marquette. You're going to be tucking it along a log jam, dropping the fly straight down, and then have a relatively narrow swing. So really focused on specific pieces of water, pretty technical, rather than the cast it and huck it that I'm used to sometimes out here.
I think that's a key point is, and again, there's just, you can't really classify every river in the Great Lakes one way and every river out west one way. But I do feel as though there is, and I pay attention to structure when I'm out west too, but I think it's even more important in the Great Lakes, just like you're saying, dropping along a log jam, dropping along a ledge, especially rivers that receive a little more fishing pressure. When I come upon a pool and, noontime or afternoon, I mean, 4 or 5 people might have ran through that pool already, and you might have the fish down, hunkered down next to some structure. So I think really paying close attention to, to that and really running your fly in a place where it makes it real accessible to a fish, can make a big difference. So I do feel that's one main difference. I do pay more attention to the specifics of the structure on a lot of the rivers that I fish in New York.
Certainly, yeah. My experience in Michigan too. You're probably fishing pressured water often.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, I mean, people who've been to the Olympic Peninsula or the Clearwater know that there's no shortage of crowds on those rivers anymore. But I would say my philosophy on those rivers always leaned towards avoiding those crowds.
Right.
And where in the Great Lakes, you may just be have to accept that there's going to be other people, but hopefully more fish.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe can make up for that. So not that there's not solitude to be experienced as well.
Sure. There clearly is. It just a lot of
So,
times much of the time it takes some extra effort to find it, but sometimes it's, not in the cards, depending on how, water conditions are. If 1 or 2 rivers are blown out and, everybody's kind of on one of the 2 rivers that are fishable, then, a lot of times you just have to deal with it. So.
Yeah. And for you, the Western New York stuff, I would assume, in my experience there, probably, I'm talking Michigan heavy sink tip, but your rivers are a little bit more shallow, bedrocky stuff. I'm assuming a lot of times you aren't going as heavy as sink tip. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I was going to mention that, but certainly a lot of, especially on the Lake Erie rivers and a few of the smaller Lake Ontario rivers as well. A lot of times just using the sinking leaders, poly leaders, a 10-foot, tapered, usually somewhere sinking between 5 and 6 inches per second. A lot of times that, in normal water flows, that, that's all you need. And sometimes maybe just a little extra weight on the fly or a sparse fly so you can get down, along with the sinking leader. But yeah, so that's another big difference, is using the sinking leaders. And then, when you're using a sinking leader, and if you're not using a real heavy fly, that does kind of open up some of the options for lines too. So, I mean, you can get away with a Scandi in those situations, or, like a Rage or something along that line. So kind of opens that up a little bit more.
Yeah. Pretty neat, and a little more pleasurable at times and stuff like that, not having to dredge. So, and they're beautiful rivers. Yep. I've got some great memories. I think folks have probably seen and swing the fly, the water you're fishing, but some of the beautiful ledge cliffs and stuff like that, and waterfalls, and pretty wonderful. I wanted to, if you don't mind, cut back a little bit to Michigan as well. I was talking a little bit about the small water, but the big water in Michigan, which I'm sure you fish some too, has traveled as you are, Rick. But for the folks who are unfamiliar, so much of what we do on the Muskegon and the Manistee is actually spey casting from a boat, and there's wadeable water there, but you're going to have to search it out. And a lot of the water, a lot of really great looking water, just simply has deep slack water along shore, and the bulk of the run is pushed out, which is why we need a boat. So we're anchored in 6-8 feet of water on that current edge, and you just can't get a fly to it or present a fly without doing that. So the boat fishery in Michigan is pretty unique. And some people prefer certainly to walk and wade. I think one of the neat things about the boat thing is the social aspect of it. You can have an angler in the front of the boat, back of the boat. You can be chatting right along while you swing a fly, and So it's unique in that regard. Tackle a lot of times. I think, that's one instance for me where a full sink line really comes into its own. A lot of times the full sink, like intermediate Sagitt type line, there are several varieties, by Airflow and Scientific Anglers these days, among others. In the boat, that really helps cut through the heavy current, and where you might have problems with one of those lines when you're waiting, hanging up as it in 6-8 feet of water, you're probably not going to have that. So sometimes pretty robust tackle then, so if I was coming back to Michigan these days from the West Coast, I'm probably coming with a 14-foot 8-weight or 9-weight, and then that short 11-foot rod for the smaller one. A variety of lines, but probably mostly Skagit lines are going to be the most versatile for the Michigan fishery, and for sure the exception kind of being that for me that the Grand River in Grand Rapids that I grew up on actually had some more kind of classic West Coast water, aside from the high rises and shopping carts in the river and stuff like that, which we all surprisingly became quite fond of those things over time. But a very different fishery fitting in an urban place like that. So,
yeah, that's for sure. We actually we had a there's a couple miles of good spay water on the Genesee River in Rochester, and definitely a real urban fishery. And we had the shopping cart hole there, so there was always consistently a shopping cart halfway down. So, but no, the
big arm.
That's great. No, the idea of the full sinker, or one of those intermediate to sink Skagit heads is a great idea. I mean, it definitely keeps that fly down, more consistently, so that when your swing is finishing, you don't have that same lift that you normally get. A lot of times, when you're swinging into shallower water, softer water, you want that lift to kind of keep the fly moving and keep it from hanging up. But like you said, if you're still letting that fly swing out, so it's hanging in 6 to 8 feet of water, you want it down there. So that's a real good approach to that.
Exactly. Paul here has a question, Rick, that maybe weigh in on, but he's wondering about bringing his pontoon from Ontario out to the West Coast. Would you consider bringing a small boat to the West Coast rivers? And I'll weigh in as well, but you go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that is a way I see more and more, either personal crafts or, two-man type of crafts on those rivers, on the Skeena system. And they're gentle enough rivers, not a lot of dangerous areas. I mean, a couple canyons you have to be aware of. So you just want to do your homework there, but absolutely. And, there's ways to get shuttles and things like that through some of the shops there. So it's really, it's a great way to spend a day on the river and see a lot of different water. A lot of those rivers too, I mean, I won't say they're easy to read, but they have enough characteristics to them that you can float a new section and kind of get a sense that you're fishing decent water the entire time. So I think that lends itself to floating as well. So yes, I would say if you can get it out there, by all means, I think it's a good way to cover the water.
Yeah, I'd agree. Paul, one no craft, the real tiny pontoon boats that are 6 foot tube, are a little, but the 7-8 foot tube single man pontoon boats do pretty well. And, you know, it's a matter of, for sure, being comfortable behind the oars. There's, you see plenty of those boats on the Olympic Peninsula rivers and also like the Grand Rapids and stuff like that. It's definitely being comfortable behind the oars, being comfortable with what water you're getting into. So would I do it? Yes, but I would do on the specific to water you want to float. Probably not going to throw one into the Deschutes and some other popular that have a lot of bigger water. But there are stretches in rivers where these things can come in very handy. If you're careful and stuff, yeah, certainly it can have its place out here. Anything else you want to add, Rick?
No, the only other thing I'd add is that, you know, I tend to be, you know, mostly walk and wade when I'm out there. I just always like the versatility of being able to kind of pack up and go to a different stretch or a different river on a daily basis. But I have enjoyed some great float time out there as well.
Yeah, a combination. And the nice thing about that little pontoon boat is you're not locked into using it.
Yeah,
you know, as long as I mean, throw it in the back of my screw and not have room for anything else. Oh, but if you know,
right.
If you got plenty of room and it can bring, you got it if you need it. So.
Well, quite honestly, the other thing too about those types of boats is that a lot of times you don't have to do a full float. You know, you can pull them out in you know, areas that wouldn't be you know, a launch for a jet boat or whatnot. So you know, it helps to maybe just do a, you know, half-day float, or, you know, a float that you're just going to cover because the one, you know, thing that I've experienced with floating is sometimes, you know, if you're forced to do too long of a float, you end up spending too much time in the boat, not enough time with your fly in the water. So I think being strategic, especially with pontoon, where you can do some shorter floats and, you know, have more fishing time, I think you know, that's another advantage of it.
I think that's great advice. You know, a few miles has a pun, especially when it's new water.
Yeah.
You know, like especially when it's new water, you don't want to be having to skip water that looks great because you're running out of time. You don't want to be rowing out on a strange river in the dark. And new water, just pick a few miles and fish everything.
Yeah, because we've all done both of those. You know what I mean? Had to leave good water behind and and went out in the dark. So. Yep.
Absolutely. Let's talk flies, Rick. Tell us, you know, when you travel, what similarities are there in your flies from the Great Lakes to going to BC, and what's different?
You know, well, I'll start with you know, similarities. I mean, when I think in terms of, my flies are pretty simple, you know, and my flies haven't changed a lot. I think you know, I've even had some people comment that yeah, I guess when it comes to my flies, I'm you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of approach to it. And you know, I try to keep tweaking them a little bit and adding some new materials and stuff like that. But you know, when it comes down to it, just, you know, I have fished this black and purple, you know, marabou. I tie a reverse marabou with some flash in there. It's tied on a tube. But this is accounted probably, if I added up all the fish out west, you know, at least when I'm fishing the tip out west, and you know, in the Great Lakes, I probably on both ends have probably caught more fish, you know, on this fly, or, you know, a blue and black variation. You know, this one's got a little bit more to it. You know, it has some saddle hackles and some ostrich in there. But, you know, both of these, they just move so well in the water. You know, they get that you know, more, you know, thicker head, and then they kind of tail out nice, and you get a lot of movement back there. So it just looks like a fish or some type of aquatic life in the water, and it's really just been very productive. I've using white a lot in the Great Lakes, so that's one similarity. I think I really find that to be kind of a good go-to in both places. Obviously you can't go wrong with this one. I do have tied in white, but just with some intruder style flies for both the Great Lakes and in out west. Again, when I'm fishing a tip, but overall, I really my preference is to fish when I'm fishing out west, to fish on the surface. So fishing some caddis muddler type of flies. It's really kind of stuff like that's my go-to. I fish a lot of hitched flies, so this is one that I like to fish. I call it the figure skater. And the interesting thing about this one is, so that it hitches real well, I tie the head back further on the let's see, do it that way. So the return wire, I got a lot of return wire showing on there, so that I can keep that hitch a little further back. And it really helps. The further back you can get that hitch, the more it's coming from the side, and the more it keeps that fly up. This has been one, in terms of, and it's nothing special to it, and you can probably tie anything very similar to it, but it's really been a great fly for me, for surface fishing, and it shows up really well. It just seems like a fish, like a bigger bomber or waller waker, they'll show for those kind of flies, but and a lot of times they either miss them or they'll just boil on them. And sometimes I can go back with this fly and they'll eat this. But it seems like if I just fish this, and you can bring a fish up to, this fly, they tend to really eat it. So I like, the little more subtle, like the caddis pattern as well. And, I just really don't I don't surface fish that much in the Great Lakes. Every year I say I'm going to, and I do a little, and I need to do more of that. But I mean, again, that's part of the difference between the fisheries. There's not as many summer run, late, early fall type of opportunities. There are a few rivers in Ontario, and even in Western New York, we get a few opportunities early in the year, and I got to start doing a little bit more, taking advantage of that. Out west too, is like comeback flies. Tie some flies that are a little more traditional. This is just kind of a purple peril with the Arctic fox wing. Get some nice movement in the water, a good comeback fly. And in the Great Lakes, one of my dirty little secrets, and it's probably for a lot of people, but just an olive woolly bugger, olive or brown, great comeback fly, or anytime the water's low and clear in the Great Lakes. It's really certainly not a traditional steelhead fly, but I'll tell you, it is extremely effective in low clear water, and you can weight that with a bead, and you can get it down quickly. And I tend to tie the body pretty sparse so that it it sinks fairly well. But that's really it's a lot of the go-to stuff that I use. Great Lakes too, and these certainly would work out west. But this is one of Nick Pionessa's flies, just a turducken, but again, it just has a lot of marabou and schlapen and mallard in there. Again, a lot of movement in the water. So, my thoughts on flies are simple. I really, I think, from a steelheading standpoint, I rely a lot more on presentation than I do on the actual fly pattern. But I do feel as though, when the water's, big and off color, I go with, bigger flies, darker flies. And when the water's lower and clearer, I go smaller and more subtle colors.
Very good. Very good. I like the simplicity. I've always, strive for that. And I think, the more a fishery over time, the more, you develop confidence in a few things, and you can really narrow it back down. But then as you're saying, you get so confident over time on your home water, but then you realize that those flies really travel very well too. So simplicity, it may take time to get there, but you realize that a few standards will do well for you. no matter where you go.
Yeah, and that's, you mentioned it. I mean, it does come down to confidence. I mean, I think that is the biggest thing, whether you're fishing on subsurface or on the surface. I mean, you need to be able to believe that your fly isn't the issue. At least that's where I need to get to. I need to believe that, if it shows itself to a willing fish, that fly is, one that can get it done. And that's always what I think in terms of. And then, because I don't want to be thinking about that. I do want to think about presentation. I want to make sure that, each presentation, the fly's being shown the way I want it to. So that's kind of my thought process.
Yep. You want to have full confidence in your fly. And if you're digging through the far corners of your box, with just going for hope, it's probably not as likely to work out well. I think the time for the far corners of the fly box are when the fishing's good and your day and you just want to try something different. So
right. That's exactly. No, that's a very, very well put. Very well. Yep.
Yeah. For me, I mean, coming from the West Coast, fishery back to the Great Lakes, I think, one of the interesting things is, on the Michigan fishery in particular, like the Muskegon, is the guys going with more really like mimicking food sources, which is something that, is different from a lot of fisheries, I mean, obviously in the West Coast, people imitate an October caddis for summer run fish. Or, a lot of the winter flies have look prawn-like and stuff like that, but it's really not like a close imitation. But then you go to the Muskegon in Michigan, you have guys like Kevin Feenstra, very, very clean food that's in the river and really unique. I know you've obviously seen his book, but Kevin has gone and photographed incredible photographs of the different bait in his river, and then come up with fly patterns that very closely mimic those food sources, which is such a unique thing to me and pretty neat. Whereas, like you were saying, the simplicity thing on the West Coast, I was down to guiding the Olympic Peninsula. My last seasons there, I was down to 3 flies. And I just tied 3 flies in I could. They're all very simple. And one was marabou and hair tube that was pink and orange, a pink and orange marabou tube. And I fished that in dirty water. And then when the conditions got ideal, I fished an egg-sucking leech variation. That it was a pink head egg-sucking leech. So it was pink and then black and purple in the back. And that was like the middle one. And then when the water got real clear, I fished black, and those were the 3 flies. And I developed so much confidence that if there was a fish there willing to eat, that if I just put that fly on for the conditions and don't change it, and and the same thing went for my time guiding summer runs on the Clearwater and the Grand Ronde and the Snake. It was, pick that confidence fly and something small and drab, which would be very, I think, for anything this small, makes for most fish not unheard of. I mean, that's tied on a number 7 and only using half the hook shank, small and drab fly for the clutter, but was put that on in it for the most part. But the fish patterns in the lakes, I mean, that was something that was so unique and it influenced my on the West Coast. I don't
Mm-hmm.
fish, sculpin imitations like Kevin does on the Muskegon or anything. But we started out like in Michigan, a lot of Scandinavian style, derived from
Mm-hmm.
Atlantic salmon stuff in olives and stuff like
Yep.
that, kind of open imitations. And those were, from guys like Pete Hump and Bob Brendel and the guys at Great Lakes Fly Fishing and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that really popularized that. But then when I got to the West, Scandinavian, similar to an intruder, once put them in the water.
Yep.
And so we took that and put that into pink and black and blue and stuff, and that became really did pretty well peninsula. And so you kind of you tweak things going back and forth, but it's in what you're fishing, and how you tie it and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that, and how it's going to sink and
Mm-hmm.
how it's going to present in the water.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting because I know Kevin's had that program. I mean, I've known Kevin since the late '90s, and he's tweaked and developed his flies since then. And I still have a box of flies he tied me way back then, and they're mostly sculpin type patterns back then too. And he was tying them then. I mean, back in those days on big 7X long hooks and things like that. So he's played consistently with that program. I think the Muskegon has it's a very rich river in terms of life, and so I won't say it's necessarily unique, but he certainly has totally locked into what's probably going on there in terms of what fish are eating, and I don't know if that exists on a lot of the other rivers in the Great Lakes. So he's really taken advantage of that. I do wonder, and I've wondered about that, where I see it is on the Niagara River here that I fish, quite a bit. And there's a lot of bait in the Niagara, and a lot of bait washes out of some of the power generation areas, and it's stunned, and it's, just kind of fluttering in the water. And there's no question the steelhead eat it. I mean, we see them. We kind of, so for the most part, on the Niagara, I'm just using white flies almost entirely. And, as the water gets clearer, we kind of go smaller and, with a little more realism to them. And, I wonder if, in the Niagara being the way it is, I mean, it's big, it's wide. I mean, it's almost, at least the lower part's almost like an extension into the lake. So there's really not much of a transition there from when they come into the lake into the water. And that could be one difference between even Great Lakes fish and the West Coast fish is they're that going from fresh to fresh may impact the way they go about or continuing to eat when they enter into the rivers. But we certainly see that there too, and it impacts the flies that we fish. As a matter of fact, I mean, white works so well there and on a lot of the Lake Ontario tributaries. I've tried white out west a few times, and it never seems to work for me. So, just kind of to try it. So, I mean, there does seem to be something to that. That's it's a selective or cluing into the available bait there.
I've white a little on the West Coast too, and found confidence and went back to the confidence flies. But that's definitely unique. A lot of white there in New York, and
and it's very effective. I mean, extremely effective. So,
yep. Got a couple questions here.
Yeah.
Wondering, have you ever fished northern Minnesota, Rick?
I haven't. When my brother and I did our fly fishing for Great Lakes steelhead book and released around '99, my brother spent some time up there. Certainly enjoyed it. Seth, though, to answer your question, I mean, a couple things. In the the anthology this year, I had an article in there on wild steelhead in the Great Lakes, and one of the 5 subjects in that article was Minnesota and what they're doing with their wild steelhead program. Actually, it's probably the most progressive, anyways, of of the programs. I mean, they're managing a few rivers for wild, and they are stocking other rivers with their Minnesota brood stock. So, and that has just been in effect for a few years. So I think that fishery has the potential to continue to get better. I'm not as familiar with, the knife is, one of the obvious ones up there that, is one of the better rivers for swinging. And there are a few others. It seemed to me when I was even doing research for that article, though, that the Minnesota DNR had a pretty good website, if I remember, that had a lot of detail on those rivers and on their program. So, I think that would be a good starting point. And in terms of, the setup there, so anyways, I know the knife would be at least a good starting point. And as far as the setup, I think you're going to be in a situation where, using shorter rods, Skagit lines, and just being ready to kind of, similar to what Zach was talking about with Michigan, just being ready to fish a wide variety of water and know that there's going to be certain situations where there's going to be slots and, quicker water where you're going to need to get the fly down, so probably a variety of tips and, some unweighted and some weighted flies, and just adjust to whatever the water conditions are. But that's the river I would start out with. And I think you could do some pretty good research, on the internet.
Yeah. And
hopefully that's helped.
Yeah. I'll just confirm probably short rods, short variety of tips, an 11-foot rod or something's probably going on all Minnesota water, or if you even cross the border onto the North Shore, you're talking small and a lot of tea-stained rivers through there. Coffee colored type winter steelhead probably going to serve all right there, like the marabou tubes, Rick one, and black and blues and stuff.
Yep. Yeah. And they're higher gradient rivers. Some of them are quite short, where they have natural waterfalls. So just higher, but a lot of higher gradient water too. So be prepared to kind of get the fly down quick.
Yeah. Yeah. And beautiful country, really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And Paul's wondering, he ties his flies on tubes and shanks, and uses typically size 2 and 4, and wondering if he should upsize or stick with those in the West. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I generally use 2s out on the West Coast. Occasionally, if really on water where I do think there's a high percentage of larger fish, I might go to a size 1. But 2 is pretty much my go-to out there, and that's pretty similar in the Great Lakes. I'll use 2s and 4s here. When my fly pattern, if I'm tying some more subtle fly patterns on smaller water, I will go down to a 4. So I think you're right on with that.
Yeah. Hey, the only hook I ever used was a Gamakatsu up by size 2 for my machine on that's still stuff, but Olympic Peninsula, the steelhead we've got really, and I only fished it 2, and if you have a problem, but I knock on wood, I never been to number 2 Gamakatsu out on a fish, and never really wanted to go heavier on a trailer hook, and you can get problems with that hook sagging and hooking fish in places that you don't want to hook them for their successful release and stuff. I think a number 2 is perfect. So none of the 1.0s or 2.0s, and I have seen people put those on there, but those huge ones, I don't think are necessary. Yeah.
I think you can save those for Chinook.
Yeah. And if you're coming,
but I'll just add one last thing though.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Zach. You finish, and I just had one last thought.
I was just gonna say, I mean that's the winter fishery, Paul, and if you're fishing a summer fishery, that'd be a whole different thing, on the Clearwater and the Snake River tributaries. It's fishing a lot of 6s and 8s, and some people are fishing down 10s and stuff like that. Those are big fish too, but the Gamakatsu, again, like the T10 6H and even the 3H, which is the lighter wire one, but very strong hook. And I'll also fish the Jackson hook too, the one which is a light wire hook. And I can't say I've never bent one of those out, but overall it's been pretty good.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, no, the other thing I was going to say, I was just going to say I use straight eyes in my, so it sounds like you use the loop technique for rigging.
And
I go straight eye and just, ram it up into the junction tubing.
Yep.
So a little different way of rigging.
Yep. Both work.
Yep.
So, and for me, the trailing part was, one of my main winter flies there. You can see the pretty long tail material, and if I shove the hook in the back, it
too short.
That long material will foul. So I would tie it on a loop knot and just hanging back on the back, but it was hanging to that edge material from fouling. It wasn't for hooking.
Yep.
So.
Yep. Makes sense.
If anybody else has anything else to say about fly, if there's any other questions on flies, we can keep here.
It's like I said, I'm going simple. But obviously I think there's an infinite combination of materials that can be effective, or on steelhead, and I don't want to poo-poo, tires and individuals that just like to do that, as part of their attraction to the sport. I mean, there's certainly that, and I know that a lot of the guys like to just fiddle with their flies and try to keep tweaking them and things like that, and that's certainly a fun way to approach things as well. So I don't want to poo-poo that, the idea of, trying to continue to develop and, build a better mousetrap.
Yeah. Well, and it's all about personal goals and enjoyment, which is what makes this all so wonderful, so if one person's into the art form of their fly, that's in the beauty of it, that's wonderful. And if the next person is into the functionality or trying to imitate something and make it as lifelike, that's what's neat too. And I think for this, we were just getting down more to the utilitarian side of, if you flies you have confidence in, and stuff like that, onto that for the basics, but then branch out if you want.
Yep. Absolutely.
Rick, we mentioned it briefly. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, the timing. I mean, we can West Coast fishery as well, but when talk about when you're fishing steelhead. I mean, I know you love smallmouth bass and muskie, and one of the great things about the Great Lake opportunities throughout the year. When is steelheading best for you in the Great Lakes?
Well, first, we really don't have much in terms of summer run fish. I mean, there's a couple of areas where there are some summer runs, and they're mainly the Skamania. They're nothing that has developed on its own as a summer run fish in the Great Lakes. So we mainly have winter run fish. They begin their ascent of the rivers in the fall or late summer. I mean, sometimes if we get some cool enough conditions, we'll have fishable numbers by mid to end of September. That really seems like it's kind of tapered off though in recent years. I mean, global warming has seemed to push our summers longer and longer. So where we were probably targeting mid-September 10 to 20 years ago, we're probably looking more at early October now as kind of the beginning of our run. And that's probably when there's fishable numbers. Every river almost throughout the Great Lakes is going to receive a few those early vanguard fish kind of poking their nose up in September. But that's that early October time frame seems to be when the water conditions are low enough. I mean, we even had last year a situation where we got a good push of fish in September, and then we had warm water in October, and we had to kind of not fish for a few days just because of that. So I would target October 1st and on, and even that on any given year it might vary a bit. But generally I always look at right at the end of October around Halloween, really kind of where the fishing really kicks in as far as I'm concerned. It's probably when we, either from a guiding standpoint or just visitors to the area, that's when the intensity kind of picks up. The one thing that I think global warming has done a bit though is it's extended our season, so it's kind of cut it short a little in September, but it does seem like it's extended it into December. We certainly have had more fishable days in December and January than we've had in recent years. And I think, again, trying to identify some of the things that are different. When we get into the middle part of winter, I mean, our rivers can get pretty cold. I mean, they'll be down into the low 30s, and you can still catch fish on a swinging fly in those conditions. It's just a matter of looking for the type of water where they can rest and not use much energy. So it's going to be usually slower pools, deeper pools, and then just really focusing on controlling the swing so it's not real fast. I mean, you want the fly swinging, but maybe with rod position, maybe more pointing the rod out more into the water, or towards the opposite bank, as opposed to pointing it at the fly to try to slow down that swing. But I have fished out west late into the year in British Columbia, but even there, I mean, the water temperatures will still be 38, 39 degrees. And, to me, there's still a big difference between 38, 39 degrees and 32, 33 degrees. So you really have to change your game up, when you're fishing that really cold water. So.
For sure. I mean, are you finding it fairly rain dependent there and through the fall? The pushes of fish are coming in on bursts of rain, or?
Yeah, I mean, especially on the Lake Erie tributaries, most of those are fairly spate in nature. So they really depend on the rain. So there's a lot of variability. From a fishing standpoint, kind of really keeping your finger on the pulse of what those rivers are doing on a day-to-day basis can be really one of the keys to success. And really just trying to strategize around that. And especially early in the year, we can get a pretty good rain, and and that water just kind of soaks in and flushes through pretty quick, versus later in the year when you get that same rain, it can kind of fill the water up for a little longer period of time. So yeah, there's no question those Lake Erie rivers, and that that extends New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Great fishery down in Ohio. But it's the same way, a lot of spate nature rivers. So rain is really a key element in what rivers are going to be fishable on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, I contrast that with with west out west, at least on the bigger rivers. They can withstand a little more rain on a daily basis, than some of our smaller Great Lakes rivers can.
a little less too. You look at rivers like the Clearwater and the Snake, the Big Water. I mean, you're probably not going to have fish not coming. They're coming one way or the other, migration wise into those waters. So even in low water conditions, you're all right. Whereas you get into the smaller rivers, the Grand Ronde, stuff like that, can feel pretty void of fish if you haven't had some in.
Right.
And same thing with coastal rivers, it can get pretty tough if it's not raining. So rain's a big variable. But for me, for same October, but really late October into November, for the fall is the time, the problem if you're gonna choose a trip from the West Coast. The too late, January, you risk it being locked up in ice and stuff like that. But the fish are around if you have flexibility of schedule and stuff like that. But yeah, that November was prime time. We always loved it. The November 15 gun opener, a deer season, always an amazing time to be studying. And empty rivers for
exactly.
time there. And what about your spring steelheading some too? When do you get off? When does the season?
Well, I think there are a lot of fisheries in the Great Lakes that are a little more spring oriented. So I think that is one of the reasons that, when you have decent weather in December and January, those spring oriented fish start pushing up then. And they'll continue to kind of push up in through, March and until they or March, early April until they spawn. I always, I prefer the fall fishery, the spring fishery. I mean, the fish, they tend to have a sense of urgency to kind of get where they're going to. And, I don't think they stay as long in a pool. And I feel from day to day, the opportunities and conditions the opportunities and where fish are located just kind of changes a lot more on a daily basis, especially when there's temperature changes. But, we fish, through April and, even into May. I mean, there's, on like the Cattaraugus and a couple of the other, rivers in Lake Erie, we'll still have some fresh fish coming in late April and early May. You're also catching some that are dropping back down. A lot of them have silvered back up and they're dropping back down, hanging. They'll hang in the river as long as the water temperature stay below about 60. And then, once it's consistently starts getting above that, that's pretty much game over. But that's usually end of April, early May.
Which is, not altogether dissimilar. A lot of West Coast steelhead fisheries that sometime in April, when a lot of times we have closures, but of course, kind of unprecedented closure go on the Olympic Peninsula. The Oregon fisheries are still going right now. But so pretty similar, and I would say the May is the hardest month of the year to catch West Coast steelhead. There's something that most people are going to focus on. So it's that late springtime, it gets tougher. And then, on the West Coast, time July, things really start ramping up. So
yeah, that's the one that, yeah, you're right though. It seems to be the 1 month where there's, more limited. Oops, still there, Zach? Well, I don't know if, are you still there, Zach? Well, I'll take this over. I'm assuming that, everybody can still hear me. It looks like we lost Zach there. It seemed like he was sapping out a little bit. Um, I think the one thing that I wanted to cover, we were going to cover, and was really just kind of, somewhat controversial subject of whether, what steelhead in the Great Lakes are and whether they're real steelhead or not. I think that's something that has always been a long debate, and I hate to get into the debate. I've always kind of looked at it as, you can make your own decision as to, whether they're real steelhead or not. I think a lot of it even just comes down to whether your definition of a steelhead is whether it's an anadromous fish or whether it's simply a migratory fish. And I've had a couple of biologists tell me that it's the migratory aspect of, of a rainbow trout that makes it a steelhead, not necessarily the anadromous. But I think each person can kind of take their own take on that. From my own personal standpoint, and I mean, this is kind of how I've always thought about it. The steelhead in the Great Lakes do come from West Coast genetics, and that they were brought to the Great Lakes in I think 1876. So steelhead have been in the Great Lakes since before brown trout were even in the United States. So that there's a deep connection there to the West Coast fish. They certainly act in almost every way like a West Coast fish does. I mean, they have very similar reactions to various conditions, which I think is certainly a big aspect of that. And every steelhead that I come in contact with in the Great Lakes kind of has that steelhead spirit, and to me, that's really been one of the main determinants for me. So, I was just kind of going through the controversial subject, Zach, of whether they're real steelhead or not. I think a couple of things I always point to is the shared genetics, the fact that they kind of act and look like a steelhead here in the Great Lakes, and they really have the same spirit for the most part. And I think often it just really comes down to how you want to consider it. It's just like most of steelhead fishing is, it's a personal choice. My choice is very simple. I mean, they've treated me well and act the same way as West Coast fish do. And in the back of your mind, I know it's a manufactured fishery, but at the same time, it's has a lot of history. 150 years it's been in still pretty healthy. And it's one of the reasons, quite honestly, I mean, it's one of my reasons that I first went out west to fish for steelhead, is because I do feel as though there's something unique or something great about native fish in their native environment. So I mean, that's the reason I still like to go out west. So I recognize that because of that, there's some level of difference. So I appreciate that, but I also appreciate what I have in my backyard.
Yeah, I think I wanted to touch on it. Being from the Great Lakes to West Coast, a lot of I hear it all the time. People tend to want to take shots at Great Lakes steelhead, and I'm not one to get offended by much, but you usually ask them if they've been there and if they've done it, and as you were mentioning, you've got a fish that's naturalized for well over 100 years now, and is reproduced and naturally in wild runs, and the fish that are being stocked come from naturalized Great Lakes strain fish. And beyond that, if we really want to get into the detail, into the nitpicking, we can say, is a brown trout in Montana a brown trout? And
Yeah.
it's not from here either. So, we can play that game all we want. It's, to me, the Great Lakes hold so many special things, and the fish, a couple things that always stand in my mind too are some of the most powerful steelhead I've ever hooked in my life, Great Lakes fish. And so, in fact, people would be surprised or want to argue, but the hottest, freshest, fastest fish I've ever seen were Great Lakes chrome bright fish that stripped hundreds of yards of backing within seconds of being hooked.
Yeah.
And so to me, they're a steelhead.
Yeah.
And,
No, I often think, from that standpoint too. I wish I had like a video of the top 5 fish I've ever hooked in the Great Lakes. Just from that standpoint, just to kind of show that their power and how great they are from that standpoint. I like I mentioned, I think before you came back though, Zach. I mean, I think really ultimately it just comes down to what your definition is, and I think there's this long accepted definition that a steelhead's an anadromous fish because that's how it started. But I have talked to and I already said this, but I don't think you were here. That a few biologists who really point to the migratory aspect of a rainbow trout as being the determinant as to whether it's a steelhead or not. So I mean, certainly definitions change and adapt and evolve over time. At one time that, before there was this prevalence of steelhead in the Great Lakes, the thought of it just being an anadromous fish, was probably well accepted. I think if you open up your, kind of open up to the idea that, the definition could be expanded to, fish that are, not going from saltwater, but do have that same migratory instinct and migratory urge, I think then you can arrive at that. And that's kind of how I have always justified it.
I think that's well said. I think we're getting to the latter part of our discussion tonight, Rick. I just wanted to throw out anybody, if they had any lingering questions, please throw them in the chat here. Anything you had on the menu yet?
No, I think the only other thing that, and I think we've touched upon it in bits and pieces, is just the differences in presentation. And,
oh yeah.
Outside of, like I said, I use more dry flies and surface oriented fishing out west just because, you're fishing for summer run fish. But, I really do feel as though between the two, I let the conditions kind of dictate, how I'm fishing. And, I find that if you do that, I'm using some very similar techniques in both. The only, and I know I've said this already a couple of times, but the only thing that I kind of see different is on smaller waters. And, this probably applies to smaller waters out west too. But on the smaller waters here in the Great Lakes, I'm just paying more attention to the structure and just making sure I'm, kind of, picking apart. I've learned a lot of that from fishing with Nick Pianessa, just really picking apart a pool. And you just, instead of stepping in and just making the same cast all the way down, make every cast with, looking at the scenario. And sometimes you got to shorten the cast up. Sometimes you're making a long cast and pulling it back so it drops off a ledge. But just think in terms of, making adjustments all the way through when you're fishing more of those intimate pieces of water.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I think, similar, the swung fly is the swung fly, and what makes a good presentation and a good swing is going to carry over between the two, and that's perfect. Yeah. What's coming up for you, right up this spring and beyond?
Well, right, I'll be getting back to a little bit of guiding and some, a few schools and things. Some teaching this spring through May, and a couple things, we mentioned it earlier, and we're just kind of putting the final pieces together with a spay casting class up on the Salmon River in August with Topher Brown. So I'm looking forward to that. I've never worked directly with Topher before, and he's a fantastic person and caster. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm trying to put the finishing pieces on a book in the next week or two. That is going to be heavily focused on spay fishing. I have some spay casting in it, but mainly spay fishing and techniques and presentation. And hopefully that'll be done by the end of the year, or published by the end of the year.
And you have a final title on that book for people to look for?
I don't know if it's final, but right now the working title is called Modern Spay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And that class you're going to put on with Topher, we're going to be sure to announce that on Swing the Fly. I would expect spots will go fast for that.
Yep. Yeah, so, we'll get the details out. We'll get the details out in hopefully a week or two.
And that'll be an August class, you were saying. So
yeah, last Saturday in August. And last Saturday, and if there's an overflow, we're going to do a Sunday too.
Yep, great. And what about fishing? You got any big plans or?
Well, I mean, there'll be a lot of stuff around here, and once things break loose in about a week or two, there's 10 different directions you can go in any given day. So, there'll be steelhead. What I want to do this year is try to get out on Lake Ontario and do a little fishing for the Chinook salmon out there. So we're going to go out and, try to play around with them, get some fresh fish out in the lake. Yeah. And then, once end of May and early June rolls around, it'll be trying to get some muskie as well. So trying to really focus on some muskie fishing this year.
Very nice.
Yeah. So and I got a lot of other ideas. I mean, I just picked up a flycraft raft too. So Nick and I, we probably listed about, a whole probably 5 years worth of places we want to get to this year with that. So we'll see how many we can check off the box, or how many boxes we can check off this year.
Nice.
Yeah. Looks like we got a few more questions.
Yeah. Duncan wants to know if he should bail on the West and move to the Great Lakes, or if West Coast Steelhead will mount a comeback. I can take that one, and you can take that next one. I think it's been some hard times for West Coast Steelhead, and I'm not convinced they won't continue, and that it won't be tough. And I think we've all, as anglers, got to work a lot of work to help change public opinion and get help for these fish. But the one thing I'm encouraged by right now is apparently the warm water blob off the coast has moved or dissipated, and we had better ocean conditions last year. And so if we get cool water off the coast and decent snowpack, and I don't think they're down and out, and that we should count them out. That's for sure. But it's not rosy, but they aren't gone yet. But we got to do all we can to help as fishermen, anglers. I think that's our responsibility. So no, don't bail on them. Just maybe take a trip or two to the Great Lakes and give it a shot, So
I think just as you're alluding to, Zach, I mean, and I think there's certainly a few issues in the Great Lakes as well, but nowhere near what, is happening out West Coast. But I think it's just really demonstrating that as anglers, it's no longer just to be a good angler. It's no longer enough to just be a good caster or a good fly tyer or a good, good at presenting the fly. You need to, be part of the solution to try to do whatever we can to save this great resource. So I think we all got to, take our part and try to do what we can, and whatever that means, whether that's getting the word out, financial support, whatever it is. I know there's not a lot. It seems like a lot of times there's not a lot we can do, but trying to do all we can is, I think incumbent upon all of us as anglers.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Anything? Is it's any
My understanding,
talk in the works?
I emailed, or messaged Jeff Shack probably a couple of months ago, and he had no plans to get anything started. So doesn't look like it. I won't make any promises, but I could see where if we do the spay class, maybe at some point we could expand it into something that, had some demonstrations or something like that. So, we'll see how that plays out. I mean, maybe that's something that could eventually expand, and maybe we can get Jeff involved again with that. I still haven't talked to him even about this class yet, so maybe there would be some. But just to answer your question, I from when I talked to him a couple months ago, he had no plans for this year anyways.
We'll hope it'll come back in the future. So
yeah, it was a great event.
Brad wants to know, what's the most interesting bycatch you've seen on a
swing? I don't know if it's the most interesting, but I've caught a couple of carp when I've been swinging flies before. So at the end of the season on the lower part of the Cattaraugus, when the bass are starting to come in there, I have been fooled a couple times thinking I hooked a big male steelhead and it ended up being a carp. So that's probably I wouldn't say it's the most interesting, but it's definitely the oddest.
Yeah, you can catch a wide variety of fish in the Great Lakes swinging a fly for sure.
Yeah,
certainly on the Grand River and Grand Rapids, we'd catch a little bit of everything.
Yeah,
walleye certainly.
Yeah, I was just going to say walleye. Yeah.
Occasionally a pike, something, carp, suckers. Yeah. But for me, the one that stands in my mind was actually out here. My first ever trip to fish West Coast steelhead, and I was on the Grand Ronde, and I was fishing a dry fly, and I thought I'd hooked my first West Coast steelhead on a dry fly, and it came in a little too quickly, but it ended up being a pike minnow on the dry fly. And when you think you've got your first West Coast steelhead, it's quite devastating to see something else. But yeah, yeah, you never know.
Yeah,
never know. I've heard of a Great Lakes sturgeon being hooked on a swung fly, and I've also heard of a West Coast sturgeon being hooked on a swung fly. Eating, but more of a incidental hookup. But strange things happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
What Duncan wants to know, what we've talked about, Great Lakes and West Coast fish being pretty similar. Behaviorally, he wants to know any main differences that you found just in how they behave.
I've always, because I get this question a lot, and I always feel as though any like perceived behavioral differences between the two generally can be attributed to water temperature and just general conditions, fishing pressure, things like that. I think both of them have a similar type of reaction to various factors like that, but it's just that in the Great Lakes, there's, like we talked about earlier, there's less opportunity for summer run fish. So, because water temperatures tend to be warm in Great Lakes rivers, and they can be more conducive to, some to steelhead in the winter or in the summer in some of the West Coast rivers, just because of water temperature, and they've evolved that way. So to me, it's more how they react to various stimuli, and that they react similarly. It's just that there's different stimuli in the Great Lakes, and that. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I guess that lends itself to, there's not as much opportunity for maybe surface fishing, in the Great Lakes that there is out west, but a lot of that's just when the fish are available and water temperature related. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah. And
But
on the other
a lot of similarities, though. A lot of similarities in how they react.
on the other side of it, the one thing I haven't experienced as much of with West Coast fish is in the Great Lakes that we touched on a little, is like that predatory food source type behavior, like we were
Yeah.
talking with the sculpin patterns and Kevin Feenstra's stuff and your white bait fish patterns. Um, whether they're actually feeding or not, they can leave that impression that they are, and they'll eat a fly like they're trying to kill it.
Yep.
With those flies a lot of times, especially when the water temperatures are in a good range and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they want to kill that fish. So that's one thing that I haven't seen as much of in the West Coast as I have in the is pretty unique and neat. So
Yep, I agree. That's a really good point.
anyhow, unless another question pops in here real quick, I think we've about concluded tonight. Rick, anything we're missing?
No, I'm good, Zach. It's been great. It's great. Been a great chat. I hope people enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to supporting Swing the Fly. And I think both Rick and I would be happy to answer any other questions if they do pop up through email. So feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, thank you all for joining in, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Talk to you soon, Zach.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks.